Hello and welcome back to Talking Europe. My guest today is Kristalina Georgieva, the Vice President of the European Commission. She rose to international attention as the EU Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection from 2010 to 2014. In that time, she played a high-profile role in the global response to natural disasters in Haiti, Chile, Pakistan, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Before joining the European Commission, she had a long career with the World Bank in Washington and in Moscow. Kristalina Georgieva trained as an environmental economist in her native Bulgaria. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me here.
I'd like to start with an upcoming international rendezvous, which is very important for you and for the international community, the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul. You've been named by the UN Secretary General to be part of a major panel looking at humanitarian funding, and particularly the funding gap. Tell us a little bit about that.
Never before has the world been so generous. Last year, we spent $25 billion in humanitarian aid. And yet, never before our generosity has been so insufficient, because the gap between the needs and what we fund is $15 billion. We call this the world's most important solvable problem, because we generate $78 trillion GDP in a year. We sure can come up with the missing $15 billion to bring people in need to a position of being helped.
You say it's solvable, but surely in this time of an economic slump in Europe, an inward-looking dynamic, the political will isn't there in Europe today to solve this crisis, is it?
Wrong. First, Europeans are remarkably good to meet an obligation to help these people, to help this country. We are 20% of the world economy, 40 to 50% of development and humanitarian aid. And when our report came out, we recommended more money and better use of money. There was a very important conference on Syria. It generated $12 billion in pledges. 61% came from Europe. We actually, if we step back and look at ourselves, we would find that we put our money where our mouth is. We do concentrate resources on the most vulnerable. Question is how to bring others to do their part. And here is what our report discovers. Who is missing from that action? Some of the countries that are getting richer, the so-called emerging markets, they can do more, but most importantly, the private sector is missing. Only 5% of funding for humanitarian action comes from the private sector. The question is why? Well, simple answer, because we approach them for philanthropy and not for what they are best at, resolving problems, being innovative, putting resources in a very pragmatic way to get access to safe water or to get access to financial transactions. And the other thing we say in the report is shrink the needs.
Okay.
Shrink the needs. Invest in development.
We'll leave the report to one side because it seems to be a slight paradox to me that you're saying Europe puts its money where its mouth is in terms of humanitarian aid. But that kind of largesse doesn't really seem to be borne out by Europe's treatment of migrants at the moment. Is that something you feel is a bit of a paradox, the way migrants are being received here today?
I think that there is no country or region in the world I know of that would receive 1.8 million people in a short period of time and not experience a shock. And that has happened to us. And I think we in Europe ought to be a little less self-critical on what we have done, because we also have seen a lot of local action to help refugees. I remember going to Turkey a year in the Syria conflict. There were 32,000 refugees, Syrian refugees in Turkey And I asked them, what are you going to do when they become more? They said, there is no way we can take more than 100,000. They now have 2.5 million. So the reaction to a massive shock is actually normal. Plus, it came at a time when Europe is being hit by terrorist attacks. We have a refugee crisis and a security crisis. What is more important is, are we going to get ahead of the curve? Are we going to take the steps that are necessary for us to live with what is going to be a continuum?
But the curve seems to be sort of driven at the moment by populism and, in some cases, far-right political movements in Europe. Do you think things are going towards a real closing of Europe away from the rest of the world, and particularly if you look at what just happened in Austria in the presidential election there?
The danger is definitely there. What we have seen is that borders that we thought are gone forever are coming up. If we want to deal with populism, if we want to deal with this right-wing, sometimes quite extreme views, we have to be very honest with the work that needs to be done in Europe. And it has 4 parts. One, we need asylum system that is harmonized across 28 countries. We cannot have different ways of registering asylum seekers, different ways of accessing benefits, accessing the labor market. 2, we have to protect the external borders. We have to admit we have been complacent. We allowed our external borders to be porous, and people come in big numbers, and of course, this is scary. If we don't guard the external borders, the internal borders are not going to go down.
And in fact, and you've spoken to leaders in Eastern Europe saying, please guard the borders better. In the light of that, do you think now is the right time to offer visa-free travel for Turks into the European Union?
You know, think of what we are offering Turkey. We are offering them to go from paper passports to biometric passports in order to qualify for visas. And, you know, I, for one, prefer to have Turks coming with biometric passports so we know who is who. Then, and without visas, then coming with paper passports, with paper visas, and do you really know who this person is? In Europe, we have to accept that we are interconnected. We cannot choose our neighbors. They are who they are.
So personally, you're in favor of this visa-free regime, provided that it comes with the biometric
Absolutely.
passports?
If they meet the 82 requirements, we are actually mandated to allow them to come visa-free. If they don't, then we have to caveat it, because a deal is a deal. We have to meet our side of it, but they have to meet theirs.
Sure, but if the deal comes into effect, aren't parties like the FPO in Austria just going to go up?
If we do not hold on reducing crossing from Turkey into Greece the way it has been happening over the last months, don't you think that they would go up in the polls? So we have to work with our neighbors. We have to find ways in which we live together in this new world of more danger. They need us, we need them. This interdependence is here to stay, and no borders in this world in which drones can fly over and information even faster. We can't be isolated.
Well, I suppose that interconnectedness does raise the question of what is Europe and European identity today. And I want us now to have a look at a France 24 report about Europe Day, which was celebrated in various European cities every May the 9th. And it goes back to 1950, when a founding father of what became the EU set out his idea for a new form of political cooperation in Europe. Caroline de Camaret and Karim Hakiki have more.
At Paris' City Hall, France's Europe minister wants to make citizens believe in the EU once again. Armen Georgian says celebrating Europe Day has been a challenge as the bloc juggles multiple crises.
It's true that challenges are many and they're important. There's been an economic crisis which still hasn't been solved in many southern European countries. I think of Greece, even though we've had progress. The refugee crisis, even though we've had an accord with Turkey, it still needs to be implemented. And then there are problems in Libya.
The bloc is grappling with growing Euroscepticism. Although discouraged, certain European MPs want to look on the bright side, and particularly at what they call economic progress.
It was long, it was laborious and painful, but still the 27 states managed to band together and see Greece through these difficult times.
Explaining and debating is also what Europe Day is all about. Demonstrators from the Nuit debout or Up All Night movement are expected to show up at City Hall.
Of course we need this dialogue. I'd welcome it if Up All Night participated in this debate, called Up for Europe. It's very important citizens confront problems affecting Europe and the ambitions of the Union.
Sure enough, protesters from the Up All Night movement turn up in support of migrants. An interaction with this European MP soon becomes tense. Formerly without legal residence, Cécile Kyenge became Italy's integration minister and was later elected to the European Parliament.
You need to listen to me as well. If you came to get your voice heard, you should stay and listen as well. Otherwise, you're all cowards.
Once calm returns, the debate continues. At the heart of the discussions, Europe and its migrant crisis.
So, Kristalina Georgieva, do you think Europe has anything to celebrate 66 years after that famous Schuman Declaration of bringing Europe closer together?
I mean, the immediate answer is we have our economy recovering. We are finally going to have our countries growing. But this is not what the emotions on the street are about. They are about the scare from the migrants. They are about the risk of terrorism. After 8 years of crisis and after going from one crisis into another, our people are anxious. And in this anxiety, I think we forget how good Europe is. We are still the most equitable region in the world. We are the people who have invented the convergent engine that lifts up those that are falling behind and make all of us richer. We are the people that make solidarity actually work. And now we are losing a little bit of that feel for us being a force for good for ourselves and for the world. And my plea to Europeans is, I know it is now fashionable to say, oh, who needs this Europe? Remember how it was before?
Yeah.
Do we really want to be fragmented, each one's trying to rescue ourselves on our own in this big world?
There's one issue which is very much in the headlines at the moment, where I suppose you could say European standards are being defended and fought for, depending on, of course, which side of the debate you're on, but that's the transatlantic trade partnership. And we've been hearing that as things stand at the moment, the French government is not going to sign this TTIP deal because France does not want unregulated free trade. What's your position on that?
I believe that we are fighting very hard to protect the standards in Europe in the TTIP negotiations, and we will continue to fight for that. We have made our negotiations very transparent. My colleague, Commissioner Malmström, put out everything that is a position of the European Union. And I'm sure that the Americans, from their perspective, are fighting for what they perceive to be their interests. We have to find a way to stand for what we have gained for our people in Europe, and yet complete negotiations that are going to hugely benefit both us and the United States in terms of job creation, in terms of opportunities for our economies. We so much need it in a sluggish growth environment that I hope both sides would find the right way to protect national, in our case, the collective interests, and yet reach an agreement on TTIP.
Essentially, you're in favor of it, but you'd like Europe to drive a harder bargain with the United States, essentially.
Of course we are going to drive the hardest bargain we can.
One other big issue that relates to European identity, of course, is the British question, and I wonder what you think about that. What would a Europe look like without the United Kingdom?
I'm not thinking of it because I believe Europe is going to stick together. So it is for the British people to decide. I love our union, and our union is the force it is with all of us together.
So you think it would not be the same Europe, perhaps a poorer and not such a rich and strong Europe without the UK?
I'm not going to speculate on that.
Okay.
I keep my fingers crossed that we will have the same family. And actually, for me, I'm in charge of budget and human resources. The UK is very important because they drive us towards modernization. They want more reforms. I want more reforms. So please stay. Help us do the right thing for Europe to be a stronger, more competitive region.
Okay, we'll have to end on that note. Thank you so much for your time and for being a guest on Talking Europe. Kristalina Georgieva, Vice President of the European Commission, and more news coming up on France 24 shortly.